hope you don't
Go right ahead.
object. He said, if you niggers don't get out of here, I'm going to cut your heads off. You know you don't belong in here, so get out. Well, of course we did, but the pain was inside of you. It still is today. Because he said two things that bothered me to this day is you don't belong here. I've felt that piercing word many, many times, belonging. What prevents me from belonging? I realized after, I knew what was going on, put it off. I wasn't completely naive, but the reality hit. I knew that I was black in America, and there's nothing I could do to pretend like I wasn't. So I knew then every opportunity I got to fight racism, I was going to do it. So it was kind of like my defining moment that I knew then that racism was real. Now I heard about it, read about it, but when it hits you, you know it. So that was the beginning, I think.
And the fact that you say it still pierces you, you still, interesting, when I interviewed Reverend C.T. Vivian, and he was recounting what he went through, and I could see it literally in his eyes. Or we're talking and smiling, laughing, all of a sudden his eyes begin to narrow. That here he was at 93, and he still felt it.
Well, it's sort of like some things you don't, some people say when they had surgery, they remembered when they had the incision. You still feel it. I guess the pain of whether it's memory or whatever it is, maybe it's hard to describe, but it stays with you. But I've interviewed people like ball players who said that one guy was hired right after Jackie Robinson, and he said the owner of the team, the manager, would say, listen, guys, we're going out here to play ball and we're going to win. It's not just you, it's the team. The team. Everything he said was the team. This is team spirit, not you, the team. He'd go out, play ball, win, come back. The team came back. Then he would have to go to a segregated area behind the lunch because he said, you always got to feel like I don't belong. I'm not worthy. Those two phrases, he said, haunted him. You don't belong. You're not worthy. And it looks like, Roland, that as African Americans, we're always trying to prove our worth. And it's happened to me 100 times. I don't have time to tell you all the times. But you hear white people say, you don't belong here. You know better. Well, why don't you belong?
And you hear it today.
Today.
You hear it today. I mean, even when you hear these conversations, when you look at the attacks on NFL players who are protesting and Colin Kaepernick, oh, go back to where you came from. This is where I tell people, Jim Crow had kids and grandkids. Let's not act like all of a sudden the election of a black president, having a black governor in Virginia, Massachusetts, having black CEOs somehow just erased all of that.
That's true. We just seem like that ugly head of racism keeps raising itself. And our political times today are not helping. I think we're in a climate now where it's okay to bring your hatred out. It started with Obama when he was president. I think they just resented the fact that he had made it. And now I think white racism has just said it's okay to do it because of the climate of our country.
Well, one of the things that I've talked about is that we're operating in this period of what I call white minority resistance. Even though they're not in the minority, but they see where we are going. They see that by 2044, no one group will be the majority of the folks in this country. And there's this fear, and that there's this fear of losing power, fear of losing money, fear of losing control. And when you now see reports where 50+% of whites think that there's rampant discrimination against white Americans, which is beyond laughable. When you begin to, when they say, well, millennials, white millennials won't be the same, but when you look at the polling data, they hold some of the same feelings. What we're seeing is that there's a fear of no longer being able to run everything in America the way they desire?
I think that's the prevailing mood. Well, the reality is just no longer just a mood, it's reality. That we have proven a lot of our value, even when it's not acceptable and then not accepted. It's proven that we can control, we can do, we can work, we can perform. And I remember getting a letter from a white mother in mid-America who said that she was taught, this was in a relationship to the Trumpet Awards. She had been watching the awards and saying that African Americans had been doing a lot to add to the richness of this great country. And she said it was that typical awakening for her that her mother and father both taught her that all black people were lazy. She said, didn't say some, a lot, all. She said all black men would rather stand in line to get a welfare check than to get a paycheck. That all black women would rather have a baby than have a job. So she grew up hating us. And it wasn't until she just kind of latched onto the viewing of the Trumpet Awards and saw the contributions we were making that her notion now was changing. She said we piqued her interest. And she started going to the libraries, trying to learn more, and found out that her parents had not told her the truth. That she now had two girls. One was 3 and one was 5. And she did not want them to grow up in the same ignorance she did, so sent us the tape for the Trumpet Awards. And that was what she was calling about. That notion is not widespread. I think there are people who still feel that way about African Americans. But the reality is the picture is a lot different from what people perceive us to be. We're doing things now, running and governing and performing and doing well. And it doesn't set well to those who want to believe otherwise.
But the key thing you said there was, this was a woman who was in middle America. We call it flyover country. We saw after the election of Trump, all these people said, oh, we've got, these people are frustrated, they're losing opportunities, and we've got to really understand them. And every time I would hear working class, that's who they would be talking about. And I kept saying on television, wait a minute, hold up. They ain't the only people working. Let's stop acting like they are. And the reality is, in a lot of these places, it's 90, 95, 98% white. They don't know any of us. They don't see us. And so they have these perceptions. They listen to conservative talk radio all day. They watch Fox News all day, which further amplifies that point of view.
Of course.
And then all of a sudden, you get a Trump. And then people begin to say, well, yeah, we got to listen to their fears. And I'm going, if y'all broke, I can show you some folks in the inner city broke. You think you got bad schools? I can show you some bad schools. But in many ways, they're voting against their own interest. And then somehow saying, well, it's our fault.
Well, I think it's always easier to transfer the blame and the critiquing to the other group. It's easier that way because it takes it off from you. I think that I really wish Martin Luther King was still here today. His strong teachings of love and understanding, and he used to say all the time, we can live together. We can respect each other. And his notion always was that he didn't think that all white people hated us because they loved to hate. He said so many of them perhaps would not hate us if they knew who we were. And I think that's where we've been derelict in our history and in our schools, not showing the contributions that we've been making. We've been contributing. And yet you've got a segment of the population that you don't belong here.
Before SCLC, you worked with the National Urban League.
Yes.
Talk about that, and also you going undercover?
Yes. Well, what happened is I felt like, I was really doing a lawman's job, but it was really a job of enjoyment, really. Because what had happened in Chicago at the time, and this was, I'm talking like the 50s, they had good business people. companies, and I'll just name a few. It doesn't matter to me. And I hope I won't hurt
It's
you.
all good.
Marshall Field was a big conglomerate. I mean, little girls grew up saying, one of these days I'm going to Marshall Fields and get a pretty dress, you know. Marshall Fields was big, and Spiegel's was a mail order, and Montgomery Ward were mail order giants. And so they were good guys in terms of like contributing with the NAACP dinner. They'd buy tickets, but they wouldn't hire people. So the Urban League said, well, let's see if they really are good as they pretend to be. And so what they started was a program to see when the want ads come out, like, did Marshall Fields have some openings? If so, then I would go, and we were always stationed in position about 5 minutes away from Marshall Field's office. And we called and said, I see, because back in the 50s, if you could type pretty good and you could speak English, you could get a job as a clerk typist. That was a good entry-level job.
Right.
So they had some clerk typist positions. So Urban League said, okay, call. I'd call and say, is that job open? Oh, yes, very nicely on the phone. Okay, I want to come and apply. Hang the phone up. Less than 5 minutes, I'm there. And then, oh, gee, we just filled it. You know, you filled it in 5 minutes? You know? So I document the responses,
Right.
and that's why we would go to the major giants, and kind of broke up that whole facade of we're good guys, but maybe not as good as we ought to be.
So I want to deal with that, because I keep making the point to people. Don't get confused by companies today who buy tables and make nominal contributions.
Right.
And in some cases, our organizations will give them an award for, they bought a couple tables every year. When I say, hey, if you spend $5,000 on tables, but then you won't put folks in executive suites, that means that we're losing out on $1, $2, $3, $4, $500,000 jobs, and all we're getting for it is a measly couple of tables. And so it's amazing to me how that still happens today. And unfortunately, a lot of us will not demand that. No, wait a minute. If you're locking us out of high-level paying jobs, if our black folks could actually have those jobs, they can buy the tables.
Yeah, that's true. We have in our metropolitan paper here a section every Sunday of people who are moving up the ladder. And they'll tell you who's in the news.
Right.
And they put nice pictures on there. And I've been monitoring this because I think I'm going to do something about it. Because too many Sundays, I mean, I've charted Sundays like I have right now, 8 Sundays in a row, not one black person. The ones who get it were appointed to, let's say, they got a job on a committee. But I mean, those real serious jobs that
Power
pay,
jobs.
that pay good
Yes.
and pay well, where I'm not seeing enough presence. Now, maybe they can't put everybody in there, but I'm watching it because, you know, the perception is half of what you get. It becomes a reality to some people, and I don't want to accept that as my reality because I'm too active and I'm too important in my own thinking to let something like that just slide by and, you know, pretend like we don't notice it. But I'm noticing it, and that doesn't mean, and I don't want to, just knock everybody down right now with that statement, but it doesn't look good for me to read that Sunday after Sunday that the jobs aren't there, the appointments are getting on committees, but that's not a good job.
So what was the point when you decided to join SCLC?
Well, I was married at the time to Ed Clayton, who was the editor of Jet Magazine, and he had a great reputation of getting the job done. He was good at writing and everything. Martin at the time, we were living in Chicago, but Martin was here growing also. They'd moved from Montgomery to Atlanta. and he was feeling the growth. And he said, you know, we need publications, we need public relations, we need somebody to help with speeches. And so he just started asking as he traveled, you know, who's a good person? He said Ed's name came up every place he went. He said, you probably can't get him, but he's pretty pricey, but he's the best. And so finally he said, well, I'm going to call him. Well, Martin called. I had met Martin before this, but he was just, you know, a minister. He wasn't moving in the direction he ended up going. But he called Ed and asked him, would he come down and give a look and see? And he said, but you don't have any money? He said, no, we don't have any money. Oh, you got the wrong guy. He said,
and
so
you probably was saying the same thing, like,
yeah,
we're not working for
yeah,
free.
right, yeah, right. And so he, and see, fortunately, my husband made a good salary because Mr. Johnson, who owned Ebony and Jet and so forth, you know, believed in paying decent salaries. He didn't want his people to run to New York Times and looking for better pay. So he paid good pay, good wages, and so we were living pretty comfortably. So he asked Paul Ed to come, and he finally talked him into coming. So he came to Atlanta to see what they're doing. And he came back home and said, you know, they're pretty serious down there. So those guys are committed to trying to make change, and he was impressed to the point that he said he'd give him a month. And so he came down here for a month, and then Martin wouldn't let him go. And in the meantime, Coretta wanted to do concerts to raise money for SCLC, but she couldn't get off the ground. And Ed said, I'll help you do that. And my wife is really good. She'll help you also. So he programmed.
And you're like, oh, so you just volunteered me.
So yeah, I was going to say, now he put me in the mix. And so the story goes now, so I ended up traveling with Coretta, and then Ed was, you know, here. And we stayed on one tour. Our first tour, as a matter of fact, was 11 days and nights. And she said that's enough to convince her that a woman can sleep together, eat together, and get along comfortably for 11 days. It must be okay. So she kind of liked me, and Martin is liking Ed, and they put the pinch to us to move to Atlanta. But I tell people all the time, Martin really wasn't all that truthful, because he said, if you'll just move, I'll get you a new house, a car, a housekeeper, a dog. And he promised me everything. He gave me none of it. So I said, Martin Luther King's a shyster, you know. But it was kind of like the best move we've ever made.
Would you, in terms of talking about those concerts, I mean, that is a really, not misunderstood, but just not really well-known aspect in terms of really how the movement was funded. Because people talk about, well, you know, he gave speeches and he gave the money back and lived a very, very modest lifestyle, but those concerts helped pay for the SCLC, helped pay salaries.
Oh, they were very successful. And she, you know, the nation now is beginning to embrace Martin Luther King. He was getting bigger all the time. And so when she would come on the scene, I mean, she's the wife of Martin Luther King. So they didn't get him, but they got her. So the concerts were well attended. So she was a big hit. And they were feeling like they were touching Martin Luther King. And so it really was a good move for her. Mm-hmm.
And so the two of you became very close.
Yes.
It had to have been difficult to be, I mean, look, he was young, but she was a young woman.
Yeah.
They get married, and goodness, he's rarely there. I mean, the books that I've read, I tell people all the time, and when you start looking at gone 18, 20, 22, 24, 26 days out of the month, you're seeing your spouse 2, 3, if you're lucky, 4 days in a month.
But let me tell you, without revealing a lot of private information, the King family, old man King, we called him Daddy King, and Mama King, they were pretty strongly entrenched in the city, well-to-do, comfortable leaders and all of that. They had picked a girl for Martin to marry, He was off at Boston, and Coretta had gone to the conservatory, so they were both in Boston at the time. And Martin knew that the girl here was handpicked by the family, and he liked her. It was a very prominent family. And that was the person that they wanted for Martin. And Martin was going in that direction till he met Coretta. And I can tell you this, Roland, today, and looking back, and the other woman's a very fine person, and she ended up, marrying well. But he chose the right person. Coretta was a woman who was wed to the cause. She not only married him, but she married his mission. And so she accepted his absences. She was so organized. Like when we were on the road, she'd call back home to her housekeeping staff and say, Dexter has reading lessons at 2, and Bernice has to go here, and Yolanda has to go there. Be sure they keep their appointments and somebody get them there. She was running the house from afar. Now, Dr. King didn't like for her to travel that much, and she didn't travel as much as she wanted to, but he said one of us has to stay home with these children. So he was very strongly committed to somebody being there. But she didn't stay away long, and she would plan her absences more when she knew he was going to be home. But it worked out very well, but she was committed to that cause. His cause became hers, and she kept it to her end, his end and her end.
You talk about being married to the movement. When I was talking to Merle Evers Williams, she at Dick Gregory's funeral, she said the public really doesn't know this just really unique relationship that existed between her, Coretta Scott King, and Betty Shabazz. And she was just talking, and she was just saying, if folks have no idea, we would get a call and be like, look, I'm sick of this. I'm leaving him. She said, we've been on the phone going, no, you're not. Mm-hmm. Just go ahead, just blow your steam off. And she was just saying how it was just that the three of them shared something that other people had no idea about. And then when you begin to talk about the other folks in the movement, whether it was Andrew Young, whether it was Hosea Williams, whether it was, you go down the line, the spouses literally were in this thing together. It became their lives.
Exactly.
It wasn't just a job.
And they all wore it so well. I knew them all. And they wore the mantle of leadership in the absence of their husbands so well. And I have nothing but admiration and respect for all of them, because they all had families, 3 and 4 children to the family. And they carried on extraordinarily well.
When you were working there and you're in the middle of this, did you ever say, we really are changing the world? Or was it just, we're just going through it day by day?
Oh, no, you knew you were making change. I remember, and you told me how you just interviewed Reverend C.T. Vivian. I remember so well how he was on the steps of the courthouse, he and some other people, pleading to come in just to register to vote, just to register to vote. And he was beaten severely, and the blood, and I see that footage sometimes. I said we ought to play it every election. The blood running down his face, just trying to register. And then we fast forward, and we get a voting rights bill, the right to vote. Now, what bothers me in all of that is that, I still hear people say, it looks like rain. I heard it may rain, so I may not go.
Oh.
And so I just I'm telling you, I just shiver in my boots. And this year just really blew my whole mind. I had no idea that this year, I thought we were doing better each year when I found out that this election, this last major national election, that we had one of the lowest turnouts we've had in many a moon.
In 20 years. Black turnout.
I couldn't believe it.
Lowest in 2 decades.
I couldn't believe